Seeking inspiration, Jungkook isolated himself in an old, quiet studio. But Booth 7 held more than just dust and old equipment. Precisely at 3:33 a.m., reality shattered. Lights flickered uncontrollably. An inhuman whisper filled his headphones. A swift, disturbing shadow darted down the dark hallway. The worst part, he couldn't leave. Every door, every escape attempt threw him back into the same minute of terror. Was he losing his mind from the pressure? Or had time itself become his jailer in this forgotten place? What happens when you're trapped in the echo of a past that refuses to die? Night fell over Seoul like a heavy, silent cloak, a dark velvet pierced by the distant, ceaseless glow of the metropolis that never surrendered. But there, in a more remote neighborhood, almost swallowed by the shadows of more modern buildings growing around it, a low, unadorned building seemed to breathe the darkness itself. It was an old recording studio, a name almost forgotten in the chronicles of the music industry, but a sacred place in the private annals of BTS. It was there, between thin walls and temperamental, obsolete equipment, they had forged their first rhymes, trembling harmonies, and the audacious dreams that seemed absurd at the time. For Jeon Jungkook, returning was like opening a portal to a tangible past, an era of literal and creative hunger. The pressure was a constant companion in his current life. The weight of global expectations, the logistical complexities of being part of a phenomenon, the relentless pursuit of the next musical innovation, it all took its toll, sometimes leaving his inner muse exhausted, almost silenced. On this specific night, he felt a visceral need to shed the layers of fame and polished production, to find again the hungry boy who sang with his soul because he had nothing else. That's why he chose this studio. The agency kept it almost like a time capsule, a discreet sanctuary rarely disturbed. And it was this history-laden quietness that Jungkook sought, a balm for his weary mind and a catalyst for a solo track that stubbornly refused to fully reveal itself. He arrived driving his own car, a simple and rare pleasure, feeling the steering wheel under his hands, the streetlights sliding across the windshield wet from a fine drizzle that had begun to fall. He had dismissed his driver and the protective, yet restrictive shadow of his security team. For a few hours he wanted to be just Jungkook, the musician, not JK, the icon. He parked on a dimly lit side street, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft sound of rain on the car roof. The air, as he stepped out, was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and decaying leaves from the few trees present. The studio's front door groaned like an old complaint as he opened it. The air inside was instantly different, still, dense, with that unmistakable odor that was a complex mix of accumulated dust, old wood from the acoustic panels, the residual ozone of electronics that had seen better days, and something else, almost a faint metallic scent, like dried blood or old rust, which he quickly dismissed as imagination. To him, this olfactory cocktail was paradoxically comforting, the smell of hard work, of sleepless nights, of possibilities born from chaos. The hallway walls, lined with faded beige acoustic panels, seemed to absorb the sound of his footsteps on the worn carpet. A few black and white photos, yellowed and stained by dampness, showed anonymous faces of artists from other eras, their dreams and perhaps disappointments frozen in time. The silence here wasn't the engineered vacuum of a modern studio. It was an organic, ancient silence that seemed to have ears and memory. He could almost feel the weight of unsung notes, of unsaid words hovering in the stagnant air. He passed the main recording room, its vastness now seeming gloomy and empty, and headed down a narrower hallway at the back, an area that had always felt a bit neglected. There lay Booth 7, small, almost a box, with a peculiar reputation among the few who still remembered it. They said it had honest acoustics, unforgiving of imperfections, and that it was cold, always cold. An internal legend, passed among trainees and old staff, whispered that the booth was unhappy or that strange things happened there late at night. Jungkook had always dismissed this as studio folklore, the kind of story that emerges in places where creativity and exhaustion meet. But as he pushed open the heavy, padded door, he felt it immediately. It wasn't an aggressive cold, but a persistent absence of warmth, as if the very structure of the room resisted the ambient temperature of the rest of the building. The booth was minimalist to the extreme. An office chair whose synthetic leather was cracked in several places, a small scratched table housing an old tube preamp and a basic audio interface, a silver condenser microphone already waiting on its stand like a silent sentinel, and the inevitable double-paned glass window, thick and slightly fogged at the corners, looking into a tiny, equally dark control room cluttered with equipment covered by cloths. The walls, lined with dark grey, almost black acoustic foam, seemed to devour the little light coming from the fluorescent ceiling fixture, which hummed softly and flickered occasionally. Jungkook sat, the upholstery cold beneath him. He connected his laptop, its worn stickers telling tales of airports and hotels, and put on his favorite headphones, a studio model that revealed every nuance, every flaw. He opened the recording software, the project for the song already loaded. It was a melody that had haunted him for weeks, a melancholic, almost mournful harmonic bass, but with the potential to grow into something powerful, a narrative about resilience. He'd found the raw audio file months ago, lost in an old unnamed folder on the company server, an orphaned fragment labeled only Demo Sketch V3. There was something in its raw simplicity, in its underlying sadness, that had instantly hooked him. Now he was trying to build upon it, add his own colors, his own story. The next few hours dissolved into the focused intensity of the creative process. The outside world ceased to exist. There was only him, the music, and the silent dialogue between his voice and the virtual instruments. He recorded atmospheric guitar lines, programmed a beat that pulsed like an anxious heart, experimented with vocal harmonies. The booth, despite its peculiar chill, became a cocoon, a self-contained universe. Around 2 a.m., the ceiling light flickered more insistently for a second, before returning to its normal hum. Jungkook looked up, frowned, but attributed it to the building's old wiring. Old habits, old electrical ghosts. Finally, it was time to record the main vocal, the emotional backbone of the track. The city outside was now immersed in the deep quiet that precedes dawn. Inside the bubble of Booth 7, the only light was the bluish glow of the laptop screen and the small green and red LEDs of the equipment reflected in his focused eyes. The digital clock on the wall, an old model with red numbers, showed 3:30 a.m. He stood up, feeling his muscles slightly stiff. He stretched his neck, took a few deep breaths, the cold air filling his lungs. He approached the microphone, the cool metal of the stand, a contrast to the warmth of his hand. Positioned the pop filter, adjusted the height. He played the instrumental track echoing only in his headphones, closed his eyes, visualizing the emotion, the story, and began to sing. The music flowed, his voice filling the small space with growing intensity. It was a crucial part of the song, a climax where the melody soared, laden with an almost painful vulnerability, before finding a bittersweet resolution. He was completely immersed, every fiber of his being focused on the performance, on delivering that raw emotion. The highest note hung in the air, vibrant, sustained. It was then, at that exact instant of musical suspension, that the clock on the wall flickered to 3:33 a.m., and hell began, silent and personal. The booth lights didn't just flicker, they strobed violently, casting dancing, erratic shadows throughout the small space, before nearly dying out, plunging him into a dense gloom. Simultaneously, his headphones, the direct channel to his music, were invaded. It wasn't just static, it was a high-pitched scream of white noise, furious and piercing, that felt like it was drilling into his eardrums and vibrating inside his skull. It was physically painful. And beneath this torrent of white noise, crawling like something venomous, came the whisper. It wasn't human. Cold like dry ice, dry like dead leaves, dragging like nails on a chalkboard, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, scraping directly against his consciousness. The words, if they were words, were a guttural tangle, indecipherable. But the emotion was crystal clear. An ancient agony, a despair so deep it turned malevolent, a frozen lament that wanted company in its misery. And then movement. In the corner of his eye, through the thick, now almost opaque glass of the booth, in the pitch-black hallway outside, a shape, darker than the darkness itself, defined against the blackness. Humanoid, but terribly wrong. It didn't walk or run, but flowed, moving with unnatural speed like dense smoke or torn fabric caught in an invisible wind. It passed by the booth door, a fleeting silhouette of hunched shoulders and a lowered head, and dissolved into the darkness beyond. Jungkook's heart leapt into his throat, a wild muscle trying to escape. The air caught in his lungs, heavy and useless. With a jerky movement, he tore off the headphones, the sudden silence of the booth almost as deafening as the previous sonic assault. The phantom whisper still seemed to echo in the recesses of his mind. Tremors took hold of his limbs, a primal reaction to absolute terror. Driven by pure adrenaline, he turned the heavy doorknob of the booth door. It was surprisingly cold to the touch, and yanked it open with a jolt, nearly stumbling into the hallway. "Hey, who's there?" His voice was a hoarse thread swallowed by the sudden quiet. The hallway was empty, still, silent, but the cold. The cold was shocking. It had dropped several degrees in seconds, a damp, penetrating chill that didn't come from any vent, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, the floor, the air. It raised goosebumps on his skin under his clothes, making his teeth chatter slightly. He looked frantically left and right, into the darkness where the shadow had vanished. Nothing, just the empty hallway, ending in a solid, doorless wall. The subtle metallic smell he'd noticed upon entering seemed stronger now. Confusion gave way to growing fear. Electrical fault, a bizarre short circuit affecting lights and audio. But the shadow, and that inhuman whisper, could it be a sick prank? Someone from the team knowing he was there? Unlikely. Security was tight, even in this old building, and no one would do something so disturbing. Exhaustion, he thought again. Sleep deprivation, extreme stress. Was he hallucinating? Conjuring ghosts from burnout? It had to be that. But the sense of dread was too real, too visceral. Inspiration had evaporated completely, replaced by an urgent need to flee, to get back to the light, to the familiar, to sanity. He decided the session was over. He went back into the booth just long enough to grab his laptop, not even bothering to unplug cables or turn off the equipment. His fingers were stiff with cold and tension. His only goal, the studio's exit door, the street, his car. He retraced his steps down the now sinister hallways, his hurried footsteps echoing too loudly in the expectant silence. The cold seemed to follow him, an invisible cloak clinging to his shoulders. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner a potential hiding place. Finally, the heavy main metal door appeared at the end of the hall. He almost ran to it. He grabbed the handle, also cold, turned it hard, and pushed the door open to freedom. The air that hit him wasn't Seoul's rainy night. It was the still, dry, unmistakably cold air of Booth 7. He was inside, standing in the same spot. The worn office chair was behind him, the table with the tube preamp in front. The microphone, a blind silver eye. His headphones rested on the table, exactly as he'd left them. His laptop was open, the screen glowing with the song's timeline, and on the wall the red digital display relentless, 3:32 a.m. A knot of pure ice formed in his gut, rising up his throat like bile. No, it couldn't be. He squeezed his eyes shut, shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the unreality. A lucid dream, a psychotic episode, but the chill in his bones, the echo of static in his ears, the residual image of the shadow, were terribly tangible. He opened his eyes. Nothing had changed. 3:32 a.m. The cursor on the software screen blinked rhythmically at the exact point where he had stopped the recording before the event. Hesitation, fear, a refusal to accept. Maybe if he just waited, maybe time would correct itself. But an invisible force, a macabre script, seemed to pull him. He needed to know. With trembling hands, he picked up the headphones. The plastic was cold. He placed them over his ears, took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, hit the spacebar on the laptop. The music started again, now sounding sinister, premonitory. He opened his mouth to sing, his voice almost a croak. The melody climbed. 3:33 a.m., the lights, the static, the whisper, the shadow in the hall, the cycle had closed. This time the panic wasn't a wave, it was a tsunami. He screamed a guttural sound of pure terror, ripping off the headphones and throwing them. He ran into the hallway, empty, frigid, silent. He ran like a madman for the exit door, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. Threw the door open with a crash. Booth 7, 3:32 a.m. The headphones were back on the table. "No, no, what is happening?" he yelled at the padded walls, which absorbed his despair without an echo. He punched the dark foam, impotent frustration burning inside him. It was a perfect prison, one that rebuilt itself with every escape attempt. Third loop. He tried a different tactic. He sat rigidly in the chair, forcing himself to stay still. He wouldn't touch anything. He would just watch. The clock. 3:32. 3:32. The minute dragged on, each second a drop of Chinese water torture. Then, precisely at 3:33, even with him sitting still, the lights flickered on their own. The static erupted from the headphones on the table, a hissing, aggressive sound even at a distance. A chill swept the room like a physical presence, and he knew without needing to look that the shadow was passing outside. The event didn't depend on him. It was a wound in time, reopening punctually. He tried the exit door again, his heart heavy with premonition. Booth 7, 3:32 a.m. Fourth loop. Fear began to crystallize into something more focused. He needed to understand. What was constant? What could change? He tried using his phone before 3:33. It had worked perfectly on arrival, but now the screen displayed no service, the signal bars empty. Only during that fateful minute. He tried to break the glass of the booth, lifting the heavy office chair. The instant the metal was about to hit the glass, he felt the familiar dizziness, the sense of displacement. He was back seated, the chair in place, intact, 3:32 a.m. Fifth loop, 6th, 7th, 10th. He lost count. Real-time had dissolved, replaced by the relentless cycle of that single minute repeated ad nauseum. Each repetition was a carbon copy of the last in external events, but inside him, the emotional landscape shifted. Panic gave way to impotent rage, which morphed into silent, desperate sobs, culminating in a numb apathy, an exhaustion that transcended the physical. His muscles ached as if he'd run a marathon. His throat was raw, his eyes burned from the lack of sleep that never came. But the clock always reset, erasing his physical fatigue while deepening the mental wear with each loop. Booth 7, once a symbol of new beginnings, had become his personal hell cell. The smell of dust and old electronics now seemed like the breath of a tomb. The low hum of the light fixture and equipment was a slow drill into his brain. The relentless cold made him shiver intermittently no matter how he tried to warm himself. In his desperate search for any variation, for any glitch in the matrix, he began to notice infinitesimal details. The scratch on the mixing desk. It was near the main fader. He vaguely remembered glancing at it in the first few loops. Now it seemed different. He ran his fingertip over it each cycle. There was an indentation there, almost imperceptible at first, but with each loop it seemed deeper. His fingernail caught a little more, a tiny, almost invisible line being etched into the worn surface, a millimeter at a time. It was the only tangible proof that something was passing, even if time wasn't. A torture clock. And the whisper. In the fog of exhaustion and fear, he began to focus on it almost obsessively, trying to filter out the high-pitched static. It was still distorted, like a chewed-up cassette tape playing in reverse, but the cadence, the broken rhythm, almost musical in its dissonance. There was something there. A melody of suffering. It seemed to echo something in his musical memory, a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. Where did he know that pattern of sonic pain? Loop after loop, 20th, 30th, the count had lost meaning. Jungkook was slumped in the chair, an emptied puppet. Fear was a cold ember in his chest, but resignation was the ash covering it. He no longer fought. He no longer tried to escape. He simply existed in that eternal minute. 3:32 a.m. This time he picked up the headphones, not out of compulsion, not out of despair, but out of cold, deliberate choice. If he was condemned to relive this moment, then he would face it with open eyes. If he had to hear hell's lament, then he would listen closely. He put on the headphones, the cold plastic against his skin, hit the spacebar. The music began, now a macabre soundtrack to his prison. He opened his mouth and sang. His voice came out hoarse, fragile, but real, laden not with the song's emotion, but with the weight of his own ordeal. The note climbed, a taut thread about to snap. 3:33 a.m. The lights flashed their epileptic dance. The static tore through the silence. But Jungkook didn't flinch. He gritted his teeth, clenched every muscle, focusing all his auditory and mental energy on the sound beneath the static, ignored the sharp pain in his ears. And then it happened. For a fraction of a second, as if the source of the noise hesitated, the static lessened, receded like a wave. And in the brief relative silence that followed, the whisper became intelligible. It wasn't just noise, it was words. Fragmented, yes, distorted by eternal agony, but human words. "Don't leave me here." A different kind of shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, cold and absolute. It was my demo. At the same instant, his eyes were fixed on the glass of the booth, waiting for the shadow. It passed. But driven by a new clarity born from surrender, he didn't look away. He forced his vision to pierce the fleeting darkness. And for a millisecond, the dark form seemed to hesitate, to coalesce. It wasn't just a silhouette, it had contours, simple, dark clothes, the kind of unofficial uniform trainees wore, and a face, pale as wax, contorted in a mask of silent, eternal pain, but unmistakably a face. Wide eyes fixed on the void, seeing a horror only he knew, and Jungkook recognized him. The memory, suppressed by fame, by time, by the very industry that discarded faces so easily, returned with the force of a breaking dam. A face seen in the labyrinthine hallways of the agency years ago, in the pre-debut days, when everyone was just dreams and sweat. A trainee named Minjun, Kang Minjun. Quiet, intense, almost always alone, hunched over an old laptop, headphones permanently on. A raw, undeniable talent for composition, everyone knew. A rumor had circulated back then, quickly silenced, hushed up by the PR machine. An incredible demo he submitted, rejected, or lost. And then Minjun disappeared. The official version, he quit. The pressure was too much, went back to his hometown. But the whispers among trainees and low-level staff were different. They spoke of his growing instability, his obsession with that demo, how betrayed he felt, of how he was last seen wandering near Booth 7 late at night, looking like a ghost. "My demo!" The bass melody, the orphan file Jungkook had found, the harmonic progression that had captivated him with its melancholic beauty. It wasn't just a lost fragment, it was Minjun's demo, the music he believed was his masterpiece, perhaps his only chance. The music that, rejected or stolen, had driven him to the final breaking point. The loop. It wasn't a random cosmic glitch. It was a psychic echo, a scar left on the very fabric of that place by the intensity of Minjun's despair. The silent scream of a soul trapped in the moment of his greatest anguish, perhaps at the exact moment of his self-inflicted death, right there in that cold, lonely booth. Jungkook wasn't trapped in time. He was trapped in Kang Minjun's pain, and by reworking that melody, he had inadvertently poked the wound, reactivated the echo. The understanding hit him with the force of a physical blow. Shock, deep sadness and guilt. Not direct guilt, he barely knew the guy, but the guilt of being part of the system, of the merciless machine that might have helped crush that sensitive spirit. The guilt of having been one of those who moved forward, while others were left behind in the shadows. In that instant of recognition and empathy, something shifted. The static in the headphones died completely. The lights stopped flickering, stabilizing into their weak, steady glow. The silence that settled in the booth was different. It was no longer oppressive or expectant. It was just silence, an empty silence, perhaps even sad. Slowly, with an involuntary reverence, Jungkook took off the headphones. He no longer felt the compulsion to flee. He looked at the microphone, at the empty space before him, where Minjun's presence, now understood, seemed palpable, but no longer threatening, just infinitely sad. "Minjun," he whispered, his voice thick, the name strange and familiar on his lips. Kang Min-jun. I remember you. I remember your face in the hallways. The air in the booth seemed to lighten. The cold didn't disappear completely, but it lost its aggressive bite, becoming just the ambient temperature of a poorly heated and perhaps poorly haunted room. It was as if the very act of naming, of acknowledging, had broken part of the spell. I'm sorry, Jungkook continued, the words stumbling but sincere. I'm sorry for what happened, for your music. It's beautiful, Min-jun. It deserved to be heard. You deserved to be heard. I'm sorry you felt so alone, forgotten. He spoke to the air, to the memory, to the echo. I don't know if this helps, but I see you now. I hear you. He closed his eyes, offering a moment of silence, a mute plea for peace for the tormented soul trapped in that loop of pain. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze instinctively went to the clock on the wall. The red numbers glowed. 3:34 a.m. Time, it had moved forward. The minute had broken, the cycle was broken. A wave of exhaustion, this time real, physical and mental, almost knocked him over. It was the accumulated weight of countless minutes of terror and adrenaline, finally released. He stood up, his legs like jelly. With hands that still trembled, he disconnected his laptop, closing the lid on the melody now forever tainted. He left the headphones on the table. He left the studio equipment as it was. That song would die here, with the echo that spawned it. He walked out of booth 7. The hallway was different. Still cold, still silent, but neutral. Just an old hallway in an old building. No shadow danced in his peripheral vision. No invisible presence brushed against his skin. He reached the main door, the handle now just a piece of cold metal, not a portal to a nightmare. Turned it. The door opened onto the Seoul night. The fresh, damp early morning air, smelling of rain and the sleeping city, hit his face like a blessing. The distant sounds of a garbage truck, a faraway siren, the hum of urban electricity, the symphony of normalcy. It was real. He was out. He was free. Jungkook didn't dare look back. He walked, almost staggering with fatigue, down the deserted street toward his car. The fine drizzle wet his face, perhaps mixing with a few silent tears of relief and sorrow. The experience in booth 7 had broken and remade him in a subtle but indelible way. It was a scar on his soul, invisible to the world, but one he would feel forever. He got into the car, the familiar interior a sudden comfort, started the engine but didn't go anywhere for a long time. He just sat there, looking through the wet windshield at the dark, anonymous building of the studio. A place of nostalgia that had transformed into an impromptu mausoleum for a forgotten tragedy. He was free from the time loop, from Min-jun's direct echo. But the echo of that night, the cold, the whisper, the pale face in the darkness, the understanding of the human cost behind the glitter, that would stay with him. A dark reminder of the shadows hidden behind the scenes of the dream factory, and of the weight some souls carry even after they're gone. Booth 7 would keep its cold secret, but Jungkook would carry its silent burden, a dissonant note in his own melody of success. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe, hit the like button and comment what you thought. Pick a link on the screen for more stories.